We have been watching very closely, much more up to date, your opportunity to take the floor. Thank you.
You have the opinion of the Venice Commission in your files, I think, and as the speaker or more on the most controversial issue.
As you know, we have established the State Constitutional Commission back in December last year, and the Commission was working for 4 months, and finally it delivered the draft amendments to the present Constitution of Georgia. We are passing through the historic process. We are replacing the present Constitution, which has many gaps and shortcomings, with a very democratic Constitution. These changes and message are very important improvements in the basic law of Georgia. So we delivered the amendments to the Constitution, which ensure the huge progress in terms of the constitutional regulation of the form of government in Georgia, and the parliamentary readings have been started around 2 months ago, and these parliamentary readings have already led to the adoption of the document by 2 readings. So that's the current state of affairs. We made a very ambitious statement with regard to our cooperation with the Venice Commission from the very beginning, and we stated that all the recommendations of the Venice Commission would be properly taken into consideration. The plenary session of the Venice Commission was held shortly before the first reading of the document. It included the final opinion of the Venice Commission, included more than 20 recommendations about particular norms of the constitutional amendments, and finally we took into consideration all the recommendations. There are just few exceptions, minor issues where the recommendations have not been reflected in the draft amendments, and all these issues are related, mostly are related to the Georgian peculiarities with regard to the territorial issues, territorial challenges that we have. So finally, all the crucial recommendations given by the Venice Commission have been properly reflected in the document. And again, we have passed the constitutional amendments by 2 readings in the Parliament. The third one will take place most probably by the end of September this year, and with this reading, the process will be finally accomplished. So as for the content of the document, again, as I mentioned, it envisages very important improvements in the Constitution of Georgia. We can look at each article of the Constitution, and we can very clearly state that in each article of the Constitution, the democratic standards are maintained or improved. So we have such a state of affairs with regard to the constitutional amendments, and the document in general is in full compliance with the legal principles, with the basic principles of constitutional law, with the principle of checks and balances. So that's the situation that we have with regard to the constitutional amendments. The main controversies are related to the timing, to the enactment of the proportional system for the parliamentary elections, which is envisaged by the draft amendments. As you know, the initial document was envisaging enactment of this system already for the next parliamentary elections, which will take place in 2020 in Georgia. And this provision was reflected in the document submitted to the Venice Commission for its consideration. As soon as we came back from Venice after the plenary session, we had additional consultations with the parliamentary minority. I personally had a meeting with the leadership of the parliamentary minority, and the goal was to achieve the consensus around the draft. And the main subject of consultations was, of course, the parliamentary elections. We were hopeful that with the proportional system enacted for 2020, we would achieve the consensus with other political stakeholders in the parliament. But during this meeting, it appeared that the opposition was not in favor of voting for the constitutional amendments, even if the electoral system would be enacted for 2020. They had some other additional concerns with regard to the constitutional amendments. One was related to the presidential elections. The parliamentary minority say that if we would move to the indirect elections, they would not vote for the constitutional amendments. That was one kind of ultimatum. The second one was related to the taxes, and we have a special provision about the referenda, which is required for introducing or raising the taxes. So that was the second issue. And the third issue was related to the land ownership. We have one new provision in the Constitution according to which the selling of the land property to the non-citizens will be restricted. So these were the three ultimatums, and the parliamentary minority said that they would not vote for the constitutional amendments even if we would move to the proportional system for 2020. So it created the very huge difficulties for us, and we had to find a solution because it was impossible for us to find 113 votes in the parliamentary majority for the proportional system in 2020. We have 116 members in the parliamentary majority, and we have some very strong opponents to the proportional system. These are mainly the majoritarian MPs. And finally, we had two opportunities. One was to reject any changes to the constitution, which would not be a positive solution, I would say. And the second one was to propose a different type of approach, and this approach was the two-step enactment of the proportional system, which means that for 2020, now according to the present draft adopted by the Parliament by two readings, the current mixed system will be maintained for the next parliamentary elections, for the 2020 elections, and the proportional system will be enacted only for the 2024 elections. So this was the change which was kind of necessary to be made to the draft amendments, considering the political situation and considering the lack of agreement from the side of the parliamentary minority. So that was the political issue that was part of the process. And finally, we managed to achieve the consensus in a parliamentary majority around the two-step reform. So again, it means that in 2020, we will keep the present mixed system with some amendments. The amendment means that the 3% threshold will be established for the next elections only, instead of the 5% threshold which is existing now. It means that more political parties will be able to enter the parliament for the after the next parliamentary elections. So these changes will be enacted also for the next parliamentary elections. One more issue that should be mentioned is related to the presidential elections. You know that there was a lot of speculations about the president's role in this constitutional reform. The political parties and the president himself were stating several times that this reform was something against the president. Finally, we have avoided any kind of speculations with the amendments which have been proposed by the State Constitutional Commission to the Parliament. First of all, the presidential elections. The indirect elections will be enacted only not for the next presidential elections. So the next presidential elections will be held in a direct way, which means that the present president will be in the position to participate in the presidential elections. So in this regard, we have completely excluded the speculations, any room for speculations, I would say. The status of the president remains the same, and we don't have any essential changes with regard to the competences of the president. So again, there was a speculations about the kind of attack against the present president. There was a speculations that this was the only goal of the constitutional reform, and they completely excluded any room for this kind of speculations with the amendments which have been adopted by the Parliament of Georgia with two readings. So this is the content of the document. This was the process. So finally, we are moving forward. We are passing through a really historic process because with the new draft of the constitution, with the new constitution which will be enacted finally, we will exclude any kind of threats with regard to establishing the autocracies in a long-term perspective. We know that the constitutions played a very negative role in Georgia since early 90s. It happened twice that with the previous constitutions, two different political parties managed to get the constitutional majority in the parliament, and finally they misused this constitutional majority for a very negative political purposes. They managed to establish the semi-authoritarian or authoritarian regimes in 90s and later on. Our primary goal was to create a constitution which would completely prevent us from any kind of restoration of the autocracies in a long-term perspective, and this new draft provides the best opportunity for that. Again, it's a very democratic constitution. It establishes a parliamentary system with a proportional electoral system, and in this, with these regulations, it's completely excluded that someone will be able to create any kind of autocracies, and the long-term democratic development of Georgia will be ensured through this constitution, which was again the primary goal of the constitutional reform. Thank you very much.